Most of my background is in the academic field, and so I'm used to hearing a diversity of theories and philosophies, and I assume this will be no different here this week. So I pray that you'll bear with me as we talk about a very, very difficult topic here. But the reason why is because this whole topic of this conference is so critically important, and it's such an important thing, and we have a special opportunity today to play a role in what I'm going to talk about today, and that is the advent of the, I call it collision because it's going to be a very, very notable event. And you'll see when I talk about this further. My scope that I'm going to approach is I'm going to talk about some selected historical records that I could find. I've probably thought about this as more of an engineer scientist type. I've tried to think what could we use that would be most constructive and helpful in a meeting like this to be prepared for the earth and world-shattering events that are getting ready to come upon the world. And so, to try to provide a little assistance, I am going to go over some selected historical records of events of communications between spiritual beings and mankind that we all know. In fact, most of you in this audience probably know much more than I do about them. But I'm just going to briefly mention a few. You might debate others on their significance or select others. I just have a few in here to try to see if we see some common themes, and particularly some of the challenges that we have. And maybe that would be instructive and useful for us. I'm not focusing on, I believe the term's theophany. I'm not a theologian here, so you'll have to bear with me in this. But I'm looking at other contacts with beings, not what we consider as the primary deity type talk, because that would be a much larger scope discussion. What I'm also going to talk about is something, and I guess I have to mention, if there's any Catholic priest in the meeting, I have a confession to make. My original hope when I was asked to do this is that I wanted to have a very, very broad scope topic because of the breadth and diversity of the group here and a variety of religious experiences, and look in various sacred texts to have an understanding of what comments they have. As circumstances would have it, our household has gone through quite a turbulent and interesting period of time in the last few months with some health issues in our extended family, some changes in my radio show. Some wonderful opportunities have come up, but they've severely curtailed the scope of what I wanted this talk to be. But as a situation would have it, I actually have more material here than I have time anyway. So I guess that was all intended. So I'm going to talk a little bit about something that I know best from my background, and that is to try to find some kind of record to give us some commentary on this, and that's the biblical record. That's the limited scope to date I'll have in here, and that'll be more than enough to chew on. And I hope to maybe expand that in the future, and I appreciate any feedback you can give me afterwards on some suggestions on that. And then looking also at these experiences that are commented on in the Bible, they give some feedback on commentary and suggestions of the significance of them, and then some admonitions, some suggestions on a good and proper way to do that, and then close with some possible scenarios of what some of these future reconnection events could be, and why I suggest them and what the implications could be. One of the things I found very interesting is if you look at just the straightforward biblical record, or you look at non-biblical sources, and we'll cover both here, they have an agreement that heaven and earth will soon be reconnected. And I think we've seen small dimensional portals already open. We'll talk about some of them today with individuals. But I think we're soon on the time when it's going to reopen to possibly all people. And it's going to be an unprecedented time, and unprecedented events are going to occur. And the bottom line is things will never be the same again. So I think that certainly shows the significance of our time here. As I get into it, I think it's important for me to be upfront and mention my underlying assumptions. Again, this may be the scholastic or the scientific side of me, but I think it's a responsible way to do things, so you know as a listener under what constraints my talk is in the direction. I am clearly a layman in theology. I'm surrounded by a room of theologians that all have advanced degrees in theology. I'm a person of science. That's where my credentials are. And I recognize that. You're going to hear probably some somewhat simple terms. You're going to hear some names and words mispronounced, and I hope you just bear with me in the middle of that, and hopefully we'll find something of constructive use out of it. I hear philosophers and theologians of every stripe talk about the leap of faith. Where in your walk and your understanding of spiritual things, where do you get to a point, if you're really honest, that you take your knowledge and understanding to a certain extent, and you have to at some point put the element of faith in your understanding on what you'll talk about. And my leap of faith that predicates at least a minor portion and content of my presentation is in the accuracy of the biblical record. So if you have some questions about that, that would probably be the crux of what the differences may be. And I just think that's important to point out. I have reasons for why I think it's useful for us. Some of my personal reasons, very personal to me. I found the harmony of the record. We have 40 authors over a couple of millennia that write from their own perspective, but there's an overall harmony of message in it that I find has to be something supernatural. I know of no other literature that could claim that similarly. The whole content of prophecy. I know there's a lot of interest here in people looking at future events. Prophecy is a hallmark, as we'll see later, of a sign of a divine intervention in messages that come out. And the explicit and detailed fulfillment of prophecy in these writings, I think, is a sign to show their trustworthiness. And then there were eyewitness testimonies. There were probably the seminal event in Scripture is the resurrection of Christ. And as we know, not only were there large groups of well-known people, but up to, as I understand, up to 500 people at one time who actually witnessed the resurrection. These people swore to this testimony so much that they offered their lives and suffered cruel deaths, committed to the word of what they've observed. So when I look at all that and then I compare it to my own data I've collected, as a scientist, I look at the research that other people collect, and then you have to be able to repeat that experiment yourself. And I can say in my own personal life, my own personal experiences have been consistent with the information in this record. Several other facets of it are the accuracy of the information that's shown and the details that are given in the record, as well as the authenticity. That if it says an author wrote something and it was that author and it was at that time, we find there's a lot of criticism of those two aspects in this information, if things really happened when they did or the true authors. And I find as time goes by that the Bible's vindicated in that. And that leads to the final step. Because of all the above, I consider it for me, the final authority on these matters. And what my goal is to try to avoid a pick and choose theology. There are very, very difficult words in here, and we're going to cover some of them today. Difficult for me. But what my goal is to strive to try to find a theology or belief system that tries to avoid contradictory positions. If I accept a text that has something to say to me, either I believe you have to accept an all or none proposition with it, and I know some of you may disagree with me with that, but that's the context in which I work with. And I don't make that out to be an easy position. I find it, for me, it's a process of being able to come to that over a lifetime of study, and it's still ongoing. So onward with the contact. I'll start with the history lesson. And again, you may dispute some of the little issues. I'm going to go very quickly. A slide per event, and I may have to skip some because of time itself. But I want to move forward with our discussions. I think very importantly, when we look back at communications of divine beings, historically, we need to look back to the cradle of civilization in Sumer, or the plain of Shinar, which has an interesting name called the land of the Watchers, or the Anunnaki. Even the Egyptians revered this ancient land. They called it, I think, Ta-Nater, or the area from which the gods came to Egypt. So they saw the origins of their gods coming from that area. And even the Book of the Dead, one of their most famous texts, has even a prayer for protection from the Watchers. So very, very powerful beings came from this particular area. As you know, von Daniken, in his work Chariot of the Gods, his hypothesis is that UFOs, or what we consider extraterrestrials, actually contacted some type of humanoid creatures that were present in that area and co-opted them for their purposes. His theory was that these creatures who were far advanced became the gods of mythology. And he says that even things like these human animal gods that we see pictures of in Egypt were genetically made, that they weren't just metaphorical, that they were real. The thing that's most important to me that I think affects the record of the future of the pantheon of gods, there were two gods in particular, Enki and Enlil, who were the two main gods that they focused their literature and writing. And basically, as I understand it, I've done a little bit of reading in this, in people trying to sort out exactly what these stories relate to. The best that can be made out is that the creator god, Enlil, that was the creator of what we know as earth and heavens, was portrayed as somewhat of a vengeful God, the best way I could describe it, not too concerned about the affairs of mankind, whereas Enki was considered a light bearer, which sort of ties to this term Lucifer that we hear more commonly in the West, a light bearer who actually looked out for mankind. In fact, it said that he even told Noah about the flood to prepare him, and provided knowledge to men that the Creator Enlil prohibited. So they set up basically a conflict between these two gods that Enki was trying to look out for his well-being. From the latest archaeological findings that I've seen, there was a temple built to Enki in the southern area of Eridu. He was known in their literature as the god of this world, and he was worshipped by the king Enmerkar, that is believed to actually be the biblical Nimrod. And some have even gone so far as to say there's a connection to Osiris. So we see a connection that percolates through other mythology. Another interesting character from that region that I pick out is the god Dagon, who was known as a fish man. I don't know if he was physically, genetically a hybrid or not, but it says he came up out of the water in that area in the southern part of the Fertile Crescent and actually came up and dispensed knowledge to men. This was, as I understand it, happened after their story of the deluge. After the deluge, he came and communicated wonders in science and in building. And of course, we have reports like this around the world, China, India, around the world, including gods in winged disc. You're very familiar with that. Egypt in particular ties Horus to the activities of this person. The Oracle of Delphi, this is where we actually see regular and particular communications from the gods to man. And they spoke to a priesthood who then went directly to an oracle who went into a trance. Was also known as a Pythoness, and inhaled burning leaves. I don't know if you would call this of a shamanistic sorcerer kind of thing, with you have the pharmaceutical kind of involvement. But anyway, there's hallucinogenic visions that were involved in this, and then they were interpreted. And in fact, there's a famous incident in the literature where King Croesus, I believe, of Lydia, actually tested the oracle. Was cooking some turtle soup and goat soup, and the oracle told the person he sent exactly what the king was doing at that time. That was spread far and wide. This office was filled for over 1,000 years, and however, it was a pretty good moneymaker. The citizens were charged at least 2 days' wages to get their future read or the question they had. Military 10 times that, so they had a sliding scale. My records show that the last oracle gave an oracle in AD 362 and said this age of Apollo is over. However, it appears from my quick searches that there are still people who are followers of Apollo and still look for oracles of that same vein. And of course, Zeus and others also had their oracles as well. Kabbalah is another manifestation that's come out. The early writings began very early to talk about this 72 name of extension of God. I'm not an expert by any stretch in Kabbalah, but what I understand is that the name or names of God or of other beings is the key to the power through Kabbalah, as well as the representation of the tree of life. And their literature shows that they're connected. It's very curious compared to the rest of my presentation, and it says that all the holy forms of these 72 powers oversee all the nations. So there's a connection of governance spiritually over the nations, with who these holy powers are. The Zohar actually says the Holy One, blessed is He, appointed the 70 ministers over the 70 nations. It also talks about a connection between the 72, which is a more a number that's a more rounded, spiritual, sacred number, but there's a connection to the 70. Now, this is one of the first conflicts you see. Within Judaism, there was the major portion of Judaism had a major problem with this activity. One quote that I found from the 13th century says, if you see one making prophecies about the Messiah, which was a common activity in Kabbalah, you should know that he deals in witchcraft and has intercourse with demons, or he is one of those who seeks to conjure with the names of God. Now, since they conjure the angels of the spirits, these tell them about the Messiah so as to tempt him to reveal his speculations. The demons come and teach him their calculations and apocalyptic secrets in order to shame him and those who believe in him. So here is a Jewish reference that says that there may be access to information that is legitimate, but that the message is not necessarily trustworthy.